and welcome to Luna Press book launch. Tonight, I am here accompanied by some beautiful, beautiful authors from all over the world for the launch of the new 6 Luna Novellas. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Francesca Barbini and I'm the owner of Luna Press Publishing. And Luna Press publishes fiction and non-fiction in science fiction and fantasy and all their subgenre. So tonight, I hope you're sitting comfortably and I am here to introduce you to our marvelous authors. So we're gonna be following the order of the new Luna Novella releases, okay? So we're gonna start with the Luna Novella number 7, Dorothy-Jane Daniels.
Hi, I'm Dorothy-Jane, and look, almost everybody calls me DJ, and either is fine. I'm in Australia, I'm in Sydney, it's the middle of the night, and I'm in my attic. As a writer, I write lots of science fiction and move over to fantasy, but always the speculative. That's who I am.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you, DJ. Okay, then we have, for Luna Novella number 8, we have Nina Oram, who some of you will already know as a member of the Luna family from back at the beginning. Hi, Nina.
Hi, I'm Francesca. Hi, everyone. I'm Nina Oram, and I'm here from Ireland. As people who've read some of my work know that I write mainly fantasy, dark fantasy, with a little bit of horror. And I'm enjoying being here from Ireland, which is not raining at the moment, which is a really big bonus.
Excellent. We've got all the rain in Edinburgh today, actually, so really, that's perfectly fine. Thank you, Nina. And then for Luna Novella number 9, all the way from the United States, we have Tiffany. Hi, Tiffany.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Jimenez. I'm based in Oakland, California. I love writing magical realism. I mostly write in the short form, so I'm really excited to have my first novella published with Luna Press. Thank you.
It's lovely to have you with us. And we move on to number 10. Number 10 is Steph Bianchini, writing under the byline of Russell Hemmell. Steph has also written for Luna Press before for our non-fiction Accademia Lunare. Hi, Steph.
Yes. Hello. Yeah, I am a transplant to Edinburgh, born in Italy, French family, and now Scottish by adoption. So I am background of as an historian, and you will see that in my novella. I write mainly science fiction and a lot of horror as well. So thank you, Francesca.
Okay, good. And then we move all the way from the UK now to Israel to meet Or for Luna Novella number 11. Welcome, Or.
Hello, so I'm Luca. I'm over here in the Middle East, and this will be my first published work of fiction. So yeah. Fabulous.
It's great that you can do that with us. Absolutely. Beautiful. And then finally, last but not least, from Edinburgh, so we're coming back into the UK, we have Luna Novella number 12, Rhiannon. Welcome, Rhiannon.
Hi, I'm Rhiannon Grist. I write speculative, weird, and dark fiction, and this is my first novella.
Excellent. So I'm really, really chuffed to have you all here, and I would like also to thank our extreme time zone friend today, DJ and Tiffany, because you've helped us so much trying to find a time together. So this is going to be a lovely evening together. Right, so without further ado, we're now going to start with DJ and her novella at number 7. And DJ novella is called Hovering. So I'm going to ask DJ to tell us more about the inspiration behind her novella.
The very first thought that the novella sprang from came from living in Sydney. I'm not from Sydney originally. I've lived here for quite a while now, though. It's a very, very tribal city, and everybody is judging everybody else in the various parts, and people tend to live in their little zones and not go out of them. So this first thought of mine was, what if someone crosses a bridge, goes to another part of Sydney, and literally finds himself in another world? They don't quite realize it at first, but they're actually drawn into some undefined magical kind of a world, which is, and that was the beginning thought. And of course, then once you start your story, you get lots of ideas and lots of layers, and it starts changing on you. But that's where it all began, that very first thing. Yeah.
So DJ, if you would like to read something from the book, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So I've just found a little bit where the protagonist, Zoe, she's already found this strange house that she's staying in, and she's having a talk with one of the other women that lives there, and they're worried about the one of the other people that lives there, and we'll just go. He wants to find something wondrous, said Zoe. I did too when I was his age. He'll grow out of it, said Edda. Maybe. Although that was not what Zoe meant. She remembered the longing for something more than the everyday. It still struck her now, although not as often, not as intensely. Or perhaps she didn't allow the intensity to overtake her. Growing older wasn't so much about losing emotion as developing a mask. Her husband, her children, her neighbours, the school mothers, the people at the shops, her students. None of those people wanted her awash with emotion and chasms. She couldn't let that kind of thing out. She didn't know anybody who did. Perhaps she'll find something that feels the need, she said. Fall in love. Zoe smiled. It usually worked. It would pull him out of himself, if nothing else. She heard a creak, perhaps someone else coming into the room, and turned, but there was no one there. When she turned back to Edda, she was gone too. The whole room was deserted, as if it had been for years. Dust was floating down through streams of light, creeping in through the cracked windows. Some of the chairs were on the floor, broken. The coffee pot and cups were still on the table, but the coffee was long evaporated, and a dead insect lay, legs up, in her cup. The door to the kitchen was closed and looked as if it had been fused to the surrounds. The walls were covered in patches of grey-green mould. Wirt's creations had decayed to almost nothing, although there was one moth tip-tilted on the edge of a shelf, which seemed about to fly towards her. The floor felt spongy beneath Zoe's feet. Much of it had rotted away, leaving her and the table precariously poised over a dirty stretch of water. She daren't move. To stand might be to place too much pressure on the boards. Zoe twisted in her chair, looking behind her. A few meters back, the floorboards appeared intact. The door to the room was open, and she could see light through it, as if through the front door. If she could manage to leap across the rotten section, she could get out and away. She turned back, bracing herself to stand and to jump. But the room had righted itself. Edda was sitting, watching her. Zoe's coffee cup was half full, and there were no insects anywhere on the table. The paint on the walls was unblemished by mould, a little faded, but still elegant. You think he should fall in love? Repeated Edda. Why not? Zoe stood, walked away, taking her cup with her. She threw the remains of the coffee in the kitchen sink, grasped the cold metal, and steadied herself. She was tired, that was all. Tired, and the thought of Tim and his old cards had stirred her imagination. Or Edda had played a trick of her own, so I wouldn't be surprised. She stayed in the kitchen a moment more, then walked out, past Edda and away, back up to her own room.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you. That was fabulous. Thank you very much, DJ. Next is Nina Oram with A Face in the Leaves. So Nina, can you tell us more about your novella, please?
Thanks, Francesca. Really, the novella comes mainly from one place, which is about climate change. It's just about my concern, like so many people across the world, about climate change. And it just comes from the idea that us humans are, that we see nature as somehow separate from us, different from us, and that we're not part of nature. So that we're somehow a superior to nature. So the story really comes from that perspective. The other inspiration for the story is trees. My love of trees. I grew up in the countryside in the south of England. Woods was my playground. The mythology that comes from trees, folklore that goes back centuries, and the destruction, I guess, I see of that. I'm just going to read the very first page of the novella, the start of the novella. Stood in the sprawl of the city, it's hard to imagine the land as it once was. Lush green ferns mirroring a soft whispering canopy, so huge it seemed to go on forever. Or the hush, the quiet low hum of the forest, so different from the noise of people and the harsh metallic screech of traffic. Not much left now, just pockets, small patches on the edge of the city parks and the infamous stretch of forest where murderers go to bury their dead in the warm scented earth. No one tells you, but it's not a recent thing. They've been burying them for centuries, for millennia, giving them up like a prized offering to some pagan god, a god of the woodland, of the brown rough bark and a myriad of green, streaked with falling sunlight and snatches of darkness. And oh, so silently, the forest takes them, nestles them to its dark earthy breast and devours them. Slowly, gradually, until the flesh and then the bones rot down into the rich carnivorous soil. But sometimes it wants more, demands more than an offering or a gift, and becomes the place of the hunt, an accomplice helping the murderer to chase down his victim, tripping them with open knotted roots or bamboozling them with twists and turns and clusters of oak trees, of birch, beech and ash, dusted with patches of nettles and bindweed that all looks the same. Rarer still, it needs no one to do its killing and hunts and murders alone. Without meaning to, she slipped down until she was half sitting, half lying against the trunk of the oak, her chest whistling. Already they were coming for her, slipping over one another, their numbers growing and swelling as they slid along the ground towards her. Exhausted, the last of her energy spent, she gazed up into the dark, almost empty branches, and listening to the creak of wood and the low, quick rustle, waited for them to come.
Thank you, Nina. Yes, we are still very much in dark fantasy, London with a very different point of view, isn't it? When you read it from perhaps from the point of view of what from within the woods of London.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Okay, so we are moving on now to Tiffany. And Tiffany, can you please tell us more about the story behind the moment you remember, you forget?
Yeah, so I'm an only child, and I relied really heavily on actually twin imaginary friends. My mom was a bit worried. I think I became more worried when I lost them, and I can't quite pinpoint that. And so this novella is really an exploration of what I lost when they were gone, and how it's been to kind of grow up. So yeah. So I'm going to read from the beginning. It's part 1, how, and this is Robert's section, and Robert is the imaginary friend. I remember the first time I thought that Lillian and I were finally through. It was on her twin sisters, Lacey and Samantha's 10th birthday. Lillian is just a year younger than the twins. I should say now that their dad was out of the picture, moved to the Midwest and opened up a boutique grocery store with his new wife and family. Their mother wasn't someone who talked about it, and the girls never asked. They laughed a lot whenever we were watching a movie where a man leaves a woman, cheats on a woman. It made me uncomfortable, to say the least, but I grew to laugh too, over time. I became Lillian's imaginary brother late in her life, and I haven't quite had a chance to leave. She was 8 when I met her. We're now 27. I've seen Lillian move through a lot of phases, but she's performed them all in some sort of gown and doesn't seem to be distracted enough to forget about me. Usually, imaginary friends or relatives or creatures, whatever you want to call them, are out of their person's life by the time that person turns about 7. Since Lillian got such a late start, I thought I wouldn't be around for long. Most conjure us up out of a basic need not met, from loneliness to dissatisfaction to plain boredom. And though an imaginary being can touch and move things, only our kid can see us and touch us back. The cake they had for the twins was absolutely delicious. Lillian saved me a piece. It was flourless chocolate cake with powdered sugar. Lillian told me I ought to celebrate our sister's birthdays, being the youngest in all. Oh, and the boy. Lillian was so hyped up from the powdered sugar, I wondered if she'd ever be so happy again in her life. And it wasn't even her birthday. I thought Lillian and I were finally through because it was the first time she introduced me to the family. She kept me to herself for just over a year. Usually, this sort of big reveal results in the imaginary friend bearer to be reasoned with in a way that makes them truly wonder at the reality of their imaginary friend, relative, creature, whatever. So I packed my things, even took Lillian's gold whistle I helped her win at the fair because she never had a chance of winning it, without me anyway. The funny thing that happened, though, is that the family didn't reason with her. Instead, they reached their arms out to where Lillian pointed I was sitting, and they reached so far, some of them even caught my ear. As children, Lillian and I never got along. It was like she made me appear just to have someone to fight with. It came just before their mother, Jillian, got sick, and over the years of decline, I witnessed all the family members do their best to distinguish themselves as something noteworthy. Lillian got rid of any pants she owned by age 10. Lacey got pregnant with Jill at 17. Samantha ran away shortly afterwards to Los Angeles when their mother, Jillian, was put in a home. Oh, and I dyed my hair blue. Neither Lacey nor Lillian have heard from Samantha since then. We know she's alive, though. Lacey hired a PI as a gift to herself on turning 22. When the PI told us Samantha was wealthy, Lillian wrote Sam to send her 5 dresses, one for every birthday she'd missed. Consider each carefully for the age I was when you should have bought them for me, she wrote. Each one better be more sophisticated than the last. And just recently, Lacey mysteriously died, leaving behind her 9-year-old daughter, Jill, who she named after her mother, and a husband she never got around to divorcing. Besides Lillian, Jill's the only other person who can see me, which still startles me. I think it has something to do with the heterochromia iridis that she inherited from her mother. The color difference makes it hard to tell if one or both of her eyes can see me. I wonder sometimes if Lillian does forget about me, whether Jill will call for me from the kitchen while Lillian is talking about some satin pink dress she's seen in a store window downtown. I wonder if I'll be able to hear her.
Thank you, Tiffany. How many of you had an imaginary friend when you were? Yes? So maybe. I was certainly talking a lot by myself as an only child. Now.
Yeah. Oh, you're an only child too?
Yes.
Oh, nice.
A lot of talking to dolls and peluche and things like that, plush toys. Also. Yeah. Oh, excellent. Thank you very much, Tiffany. Oh, and you're back. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay, so Luna Novella number 10, The Chancels of Mainz by Hemmell. So tell us about the story behind the novella and how you got to write the story.
Well, in my many lives, that's I've done a lot of things, but I am an historian, and I've written a lot about Inquisition in articles for academia and for Luna Press as well. So, and as one day, one of my writing buddies asked me, but you have written a lot about, you always talk about Inquisition, write something about Inquisition, a novel or something like that. So that was the result. And it takes, the idea came from one of my destinations when I was a student as an Erasmus. I went to Mainz, and then this is something sort of, it's many things. It's a queer novella, it's a science fiction, it's alternate history. So a lot of stuff.
So, and of course you visited the cathedral itself.
Yes, yeah. And the chancellor, this is something special about the cathedral. It has two chancels. Generally, cathedrals have just one, and this has two. And there are a lot of theories in history why it has two chancels. So that's my own vision of the reason why it has two chancels.
Excellent. Would you like to read us?
Yes, it is not the beginning because it was too long. So it's part of chapter 1, but it's later on. Herman walked in the auditorium looking around. The woman was staring at the large wooden cross at the wall, and as he walked in, she turned, making him wince. She was not the old hag he had imagined. Elise Schonenberg was in her mid-30s, with long blonde hair and clear blue eyes. Her gown was velvet and silk, in black and carmine color, rich and sophisticated, not something a commoner, albeit well-off, would wear. A jewel, a rare yellow topaz, was dangling from her neck. The most surprising thing was, however, her expression. There was no fear in her gaze, only cold contempt. Let go of my brother, Inquisitor. I know why he's here, and what kind of question you're asking. You're wasting your time. He will never give you the answer you want from him. Herman's eyes flared at that arrogant statement. Everybody talks under interrogation. I know my trade. You will only manage to kill him. He touched the iron cross over his chest. Stubbornness is a sin as much as continuing in heresy. He's not stubborn. He's not guilty of the sin you are accusing him. And what about you? He leaned toward her, towering on the woman. Do you worship the light bearer? Oh, Satan, he never spoke to me. A faint smile appeared on her delicate features. Your devil, provided it does exist, is of no interest to us. Herman crossed himself and took a step away from her. This is blasphemy. Is not the truth what you're searching for, Brother Herman de Wilt? You who attended the Sorbonne and Freiburg, the youngest inquisitor in the history of your order. A malicious smile curved their lips. Sure, you are the most handsome they ever had. He remained speechless for one moment, deciding that the woman had to inquire about him. He took a mental note to find out who among his inept brothers had talked too much and scolded them. Ask your question to me, you foolish Dominican, not old enough to be a priest yet. I shall reply. Herman couldn't believe she was talking to him that way, her chin definitely up. He repressed with difficulty the instinct of slapping the brazen face, not willing to give in to her provocations. What a woman would consort with the devil says is not to be trusted. He glanced at the door. This is why you will be properly questioned about your brother's beliefs and yours and your sect shady practice, but not here, not now. I see. Her eyes glittered. You intend to torture me as well. We use the church-approved instruments for interrogating the heretics. Yes, how else can I extract the truth from you? Only pain can bring pure and candid words to the sinner lips. The woman laughed. I fear you not, De Wilt. Herman noticed that she didn't move when the two novices come to take her away. Put her in isolation, he instructed the younger brothers. Leave her alone for the night so that she has the time to think about what's to come and repent. He stared at her. Tomorrow morning, she let them put the irons around her waist without a word, but when they pushed her away toward the exit, she stops, raising her head and staring at him. You made a fatal mistake, Inquisitor. You have no idea of what you have stepped into.
Thank you very much, Steph. And obviously, when you read the rest of the novella, yes, you'll feel really sorry for poor Herman. Things are about to get a really nasty turn. Thank you very much. So from historical horror, I suppose, speculative horror, yes, we are now moving back to magical realism, and we are going to find out more about the novella called Luca. Or would you like to tell us something about your novella first, please?
Thanks, Francesca. So for me, as the first manuscript that I've ever written, Luca wasn't something that came to me as much as it was something that I needed to get off my chest. Luca at its core was my way of processing everything that I went through up until that moment in my life. When I was 16, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And because of that, I dropped out of high school. And all I did for a whole year was to try and survive. There's no other way to put it. Well, that year is what my novella speaks of. What it means to drown emotionally and what it feels like. When I started writing Luca, that was definitely its entire purpose. I wanted others to feel the pain that I felt. But as my depression improved, I realized that I wanted something more from this novella. I wanted a beacon, and I wanted it to radiate with hope. And that's how I came up with the second protagonist in this novella, Danny. So the novella as it is today hops between Danny and Luca's perspectives, between depression and health, between hope and despair. Okay, so I'll read a little passage from Luca, just the beginning. Okay. Luca opens her eyes to the unbearable brightness of the sun seeping in through her open window. A shy gust of wind flirtatiously tickles her face as she sits up in her bed. It's too much to handle. Everything is. Compromised, she drops her head back onto her mustard pillow and lifts her butterfly blanket up to the very tip of her nostrils. She takes in a deep breath through her nose, filling herself with warm air, smelling of her body odor, and the strangely comforting smell of freshly washed sheets. You gotta get up, she thinks, says to herself. She had always spoken to herself. She was never alarmed by the voices inside her, not even the ones she could barely control. After around 30 minutes of staring at her egg-colored ceiling, Luca finally sits up in her bed. Time for take two. Her room is flooded with light. She can't help but choke on it. While squinting, she flings her butterfly blanket off her young body and gets out of bed in a quick motion. She ignores the little black dots that come creeping in from the corners of her vision and opens the bedroom door. She walks down the empty hall to the bathroom that she shares with her older sister. There, she takes a shower, trying to keep it short in order to avoid the cluster of thoughts in her head, threatening to pile up until her brain is filled to the brim, threatening to explode. She gets out of the shower and dries herself off, yet her feet feel awfully wet, so she violently drags them across the soaked bath mat, seeming only to wet them even further. Frustrated, she walks out of the bathroom with a towel wrapped around her body and goes into her room to dress. She leaves a slimy trail of youth behind her, like a snail in the winter. Back in her room, she gets dressed in the usual oversized jacket and mom jeans. Never tights, God forbid. Those things require full commitment to the shape of your body. Luca, are you coming to eat breakfast? Her sister screams from the kitchen. Luca only rolls her eyes instinctively. Then she mindlessly puts on a pair of socks over her dripping feet and makes her way towards the kitchen. Breakfast is filled with words and bowls of cereal not worth mentioning. Only her sister and herself, the way it always is. And as soon as she manages to cut herself loose from her sister's attention, she slips out the door and goes straight to her bike. Her eyes melt into her heart when she sees them leaning elegantly on the street lamp, exactly where she had left them the night before. She loves her bike. She loves them because they're hers. It's only two wheels connected by metal, colored with fuchsia and dust, but somewhere in between the wheels and the hand grips lies her independence. Somewhere in between the faded fuchsia and the high seat lives her freedom. She bikes fast, always fast. She's not content until she's taken aback by her speed, until her heart skips a beat. In that lost beat lies her excitement, which up until that moment had been dormant deep between her ribs. She loves the aerial resistance under her chin that lifts her face up to the clouds. She loves the wind that blows her headache deep into oblivion, because otherwise her head always hurts. She always hurts.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing the story with us. As you can imagine, stories touch people in many different ways. And of course, when you know the story, being quite personal as well, it touches you in a very different way. So thank you for sharing it with us, because I do actually believe that you have been able to transform into also a beacon of hope. And when you read the novellas, you can understand exactly what I mean. And I think that is also a very important message to give. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we are now going to Luna Novella number 12, and The Queen of the High Fields by Rhiannon. So Rhiannon, would you like to tell us about your story?
Sure. So as I've already mentioned on the Luna Press website, I did see the Queen of the Highfields first came to me in a dream where I saw this strange island and this powerful woman. But today I can talk a little bit more about some of the other themes that dream then inspired and connected to. And a big one for me is sense of identity and lost culture and belonging. I live in Edinburgh, but I'm actually Welsh. And so a lot of living in another Celtic country away from your own, you end up having like a bit of a complicated relationship to my own Welshness. But it was something that was never quite clear, even when I did live in Wales. I even have memories of certain Welsh cultural things that happened with me that later on, upon researching, I was like, I'm not really sure where that comes from. So much of ancient Welsh culture was an oral history, oral tradition, and it got lost like over hundreds of years. So there's so much that we're still just trying to piece together. So a lot of this is figuring out what are those things that got lost in history and what inspired some of those tales that we have today in things such as the Mabinogion. So the reading I'm going to do today is an abridged version of chapter 2, where Caris is returning to the Highfields for the first time in 10 years. Grey water slapped the side of the boat. We bounced as we cut across the waves, sending a salty spray up and into our hair. We should go round, said Corin, over the sound of the motor, squinting into the wind. I shook my head and gripped the tiller handle tighter. Trust me, I mouthed back at him. I could alter the course, go with the waves, go round, but this is the only way. There's no going round with the Highfields. There's only through. The sky was grey. Corin and his friend, I couldn't remember his name, sat looking out the front of the dinghy. They shared talk I couldn't hear over the wind and the motor. Corin's hair fluttered like a moth's wings. He turned a smile my way and I waved back, kicking myself for letting a pretty face turn my head like this. To think that was all it took to send me back. I'd met Corin last night at the Seven's End Inn, one of the last old man pubs left since the pilgrims and the tourists settled in, and the only place a local like me could be left alone with her pint. Every day, the small fishing town was taken over by tourists from all over, walking up and down the boardwalk, following tour guides, taking the haphazard and wholly inaccurate History of the Highfields ride, built from the remains of the old ghost train in the now revived and reimagined Abergavenny Fair, wandering through shops selling T-shirts, fridge magnets, and phone covers saying, "Chase the light." Then, when the sun went down, hundreds of revelers took over the Black Beach each night, wearing flower crowns and submersing themselves in vats of cheap wine and fucking furiously on the cold pebbles, hoping to recreate the moonlit bacchanalia they imagined on the other side of the water. This morning, the tourists and the remnants of last night's shivering revelers have been beaten back by the unrelenting drizzle that came down in curtains of white noise, snaking in waves across the tossing surface of the sea. A small group gathered at the pier despite the rain, hoping to grab a photo of that famous glow on the horizon, to catch an air of that divine peace, inspiration, resurrection, destruction, whatever it was they were seeking coming across on the wind. A few travelers each year would come here with a rowboat, dinghy, or some other raft of their own creation and attempt to cross the sea to the promised shore, hoping their faith and determination would win them passage onto the Highfields themselves. Some of them claimed you had to build your boat yourself to pass, but Hazard and I hadn't done that. We'd rented ours, and who would know better than us? I even knew a few who had swum it. I remembered at least one from my time on the Highfields, but that was 10 years ago. Had it really been 10 years since I'd left the Highfields? How could a decade creep up on me like that? I suppose I'd become too used to the slow crawl of time in that unnatural place. Still, I'd had 10 years to escape. I'd promised myself I'd head inland, start a new life in a landlocked city or on the top of a mountain. But I hadn't gone far since coming back ashore. I was still here, still stuck in Seven's End, despite the tourists and the pilgrims, despite everything, clinging to this grey rock dotted with Christmas lights and hangovers. Have you met her? Corin had asked me. I'd smiled, coquettishly I'd hoped, and said, met her? I know her. That's how we ended up out in the strait, bouncing along in my dinghy in the grey of the early morning before the tour boats started their daily orbit, salt on my lips, head a tangle with too much drink, hope, and regret. I was always learning new things about myself. That day I learned that I could sell out a friend for a chance at a pretty young man. Or perhaps that, even after 10 years of promising myself I'd leave, I'd take any excuse to go back. How long before we get here? Corin's friend, what was his name? Shouted over the noise of the boat and the sea. Peter, that's not how it works, said Corin. Peter, okay. Corin explained that I was working to attract the high fields to us through the use of higher vibrations created through a strict paleo diet and a positive mindset. All hilariously wrong, of course, but his youthful confidence was so adorable, I couldn't bring myself to correct him. Peter frowned, looking between me and Corin, trying to figure out if he was pulling his leg, no doubt. I was surprised to see him when I met Corin down at the harbour that morning. I didn't remember Corin mentioning a friend, but was too hungover to push the issue. Peter seemed Corin's exact opposite. But then again, I suppose anyone might have said the same of me and Hazard back in the day. She was the centre of any room she was ever in, even before she became the queen. Whereas the waves turned sluggish and slow. We're getting close.
Excellent, thank you, Rhiannon. And when you get to meet the queen, then yeah, the party is really gonna start. So it's actually been very, very interesting for me to go from one novella to the others as we were working together through the editing process, etc. Because obviously both Rhiannon and Steph, your novellas have quite a strong historical background, in a sense, with all the research, for example, for you into the Welsh mythology and the literature in existence. And obviously, Steph, for you, because the novella does have an incredible amount of sources coming from at the time, from the Inquisition as well, including the Malleus Maleficarum, of course. So you obviously were very keen. How did you approach your research, your historical research that seeped into your novellas? And Rhiannon, would you like to tell us a little bit about how you went about your research, the things you wanted to include?
Okay, well, a lot of mine came up because I had a sense of the relationship between Caris and Hazard came first. But after a little bit, I realized I needed to root this a little bit more into a lot more of the culture, a little bit more of like the mythology. And the more I dug, the more I found stuff that was very interesting. So first of all, I went into the Mabinogion, which is the collection of old folk tales. Even the version we have right now is sort of heavily Christianized in a lot of places. And you'll see from the Queen of the Highfields, you can see that even the version that we have doesn't properly reflect perhaps some of the oral traditions that went back. But there's lots in there that it inspired a lot of like Arthurian myth. There's stuff like Gawain and the Green Knight is quite close as well to what happens with Pwyll and Aron, king of Annwn, Annwn being the other world, not wanting to get into too much detail there. But a big part of it that was quite interesting for me was finding out the history of Iolo Morgannwg, who was a historian himself, but was also very much into trying to revive Welsh culture, but to the point that we're not entirely sure what he made up and what is actual old culture, because he muddied things a fair bit. I am in no way an expert. I am in no way an actual trained historian. So a lot of this is just my own desk research, but from what I saw, even stuff from my own history. We've got an arts festival called the Eisteddfod, and as part of the Eisteddfod, you have a cheering of the bard, which is the best poet. And I won this as a child. And what happens is they call you out from the hall, and then you have a procession down the hall, and they sit you in a wooden throne, and they put a cloak over your shoulders, and they open a sword above your head, and they chant something in Welsh a couple of times. And that seems to be a thing. Now, to me, that was just normal. But every time I tell people this, they sort of go a bit like, were you in a cult? And I thought, no, that's just ancient Welsh tradition. Don't you guys have stuff like this? But then I found out that some of this stuff was partly created by Iolo Morganwg. So then I'm like, well, is this ancient? Or is this guy that just made it up something like 200 years ago? So it's a lot of figuring out of like, what's made up and what actually goes back. But I think I'm not trying to say what's actually true. And I think that sort of helps with what I'm doing. I'll let a real historian speak now.
I find it fascinating because it's very helpful if you don't know the culture, if you don't know something. Actually, this is a way of learning to an extent, or at least to make you aware of certain things. Because, for example, moving to you, Steph, if you think about, the Inquisition has a pretty much, well, quite a bad name, but the witch hunt developed very differently across Europe.
Yes.
So what was the thing that you found most fascinating when you were doing all your research on witchcraft?
Yeah, I must say, witchcraft was one of the topic on my degree, because strangely enough, for someone who ended up doing something very mathematical oriented, I have a first degree in history, because at the time I have no idea what to do coming from classical study, from Latin. I say, oh, okay, I'll study history. And I ended up studying witchcraft because it was so fascinating. It was so strange that you had really witch hunt in the modern history. And interestingly, the Inquisition got all the bad rap for chasing witches, where it was actually not the Roman Inquisition to chase. They were much more about heretics, because it was power. Church in Italy was, and you know very well, was especially about power. And so heresy was very much a danger. But witches, well, at the beginning, but then, and it was never as bad as was, for example, in Germany, for many different reasons. So for me, it was interesting to write something that was explaining, putting that in fiction, because that in fiction you see that very well in the novel, and it's absolutely true. That was things went. Then all the rest, of course, is fictional. But I found a lot of pleasure of writing something I had to study, and very different for very different reasons.
Very, very good. Yeah. Again, it's something that teaches you as well, doesn't it? So for that was incredible. Even discovering more about the cathedral in Mainz, that was certainly
that was the fun part.
So Tiffany, would you like to talk a little bit about the structure of your novella? Because it's obviously non-linear, but it does actually, it can lend itself perfectly to the kind of story you were trying to create. Would you like to tell us more about that?
Sure. So the novella actually started off as a short story, and I thought I had tightly finished it, but it just stuck with me, and I just kept thinking about all of the other characters I had crammed into that short story, and I really wanted to expand it. And everybody's point of view was so important to me, because I have these unreal characters, these imagined beings. I thought it would be really interesting to let the imaginary friend kind of drive the narrative, and then have all of the physically real people kind of insert themselves and give their aspect of how their lives have gone. And I really like playing with the narrative in that way, going back and forth. And yeah.
I think it lends, like I said, it lends really itself very well to what you did, because you get to learn about all this character in quite some depth, which is always obviously something you want. I know that novella doesn't have the same space as a novel, but you were able to give it the right amount of depth to make you care about all of them. And obviously, I can't say too much, because otherwise we spoil it, but That's great. Thank you. So Nina, obviously, before we were discussing history, but to an extent, you know, mythology, folklore, all your work to date, especially the one I'm talking about, specifically the one with Luna Press, from your first short story with us, even through your young adult trilogy, you have folklore really at heart. You seem to be really passionate about, and you know quite a lot. So tell us a little bit more about the folk, maybe influence on you as a writer. What do you know, or anything else that went into the novella, for example?
I think I've always had an interest with folklore ever since I was quite young. And then moving to Ireland, I discovered much more about Irish mythology and folklore. And I think a lot of my early work was sort of exploded with this sudden understanding and learning about Irish mythology. So, but I think more recently I've been going back to my roots and going back to more English mythology. And for the novella, I guess it's one of my first memories, the sort of mythology that I remember being aware of from a very young age, which is the mythology of the Green Man. And I find that very fascinating, because the more I research for the novella about the Green Man, the more I realise that it's almost impossible to get a grip or get a sense of what the Green Man is and where he comes from. He seems to have changed so much over the years, and there's been so much written about him that is very similar to what Rhiannon's saying. It's a modern interpretation that when you go back, it's quite hard to get a sense of where he really comes from. And I guess in part of the novella was this imagining that actually he came from the origins of humans right back to Africa, really, that he's been with us in some way and across vast different cultures in so many different ways, that he kind of unites human in a way, he unifies humans. So I think that was a big influence. But then again, going back to the climate change, was this idea of imagining the Green Man, of what he makes of the destruction of his world, really. If you imagine the Green Man as forests, woods, trees, what would he make of what we're doing to those habitats? So I think that's kind of the idea of the main thrust of it, is almost if the Green Man came back out of the mist of time, what would he think of us?
Yes, a question very much on our minds, especially at the time of recording this. Obviously, we've got the COP26 happening just at our doorstep, so a lot to think about for sure. Thank you, Nina. So thinking about climate, actually, DJ, your novella does explore a woman's journey. I don't want to say too much, but amongst her journey, which is quite, I suppose, introspective and psychological to an extent, but there are also themes, again, of environment, of climate change. So would you like to tell us more about this aspect?
Okay. Oh, sure. It's where the place where she's at, or the time that she's at. She's gone to somewhere where the water is rising, houses are starting to crumble, people are starting to move away from certain, or just abandoning. And that comes out in various ways. There's people that are trying to, almost a cult of cosseting their babies and floating them through the water. We have people that are drawn to the water. There's this whole theme of like the wild bush taking over and stopping her from leaving, and some of the insects and things like that. So it's, none of it is, I hope, too like clear cut and obvious, because it's really meant to be almost a dreamlike place where she is. But it's just that kind of seeping through of another reality where the environment's taken over. We've made it happen, but in this story, it's kind of run with that and it's doing its own thing, and not to anyone's benefit, really. Yeah.
This makes sense because, of course, current events inspire writers constantly, don't they? So whatever is happening out there is reflected in our writing. We don't always go back to the past and rework something. Writers look at the future and imagine alternatives as well. And then they look at the present and what's around them. And that really enters our subconscious and our consciousness as well in the way we write. So this is obviously, it's part of the human nature as well to express this through art, your reality through art, in this case, obviously through the medium of writing. Yeah, thank you. Now, or obviously, in your novella, as we discussed before, was a way to deal with depression and with reality. You've used magical realism to do that, which made it, I think, an incredible and perhaps even more powerful work than if you had just written, a straight piece. Would you tell us more about this use of this subgenre of fantasy and science fiction?
So I believe that words are everything. They're power. They're a way to connect with others, but in a sense, they're also very limited. I think that there's, especially in the sense of trying to convey your feelings through them, sometimes it's very hard. Sometimes there aren't the words to convey what you feel. And I think that magical realism is kind of like a loophole for that. Without saying exactly what you mean, you can use a metaphor to explain what it feels like. Magical realism is a metaphor, I think. And I think that through that surrealistic tool, I managed to explain what it truly felt like, in a sense. And also it kind of made it a little bit ambiguous. Some people maybe feel other things in the story that I didn't initially mean for them to feel, but that's what makes it interesting.
It's like, in a sense, it feels like reading a painting, the images are so strong. And I think that was one of the reasons why it was so powerful. The content was amplified by these very strong images, and the idea of the water, the way it plays, and the idea of the flight as well, the air, the sky. So that was an excellent way of expressing a very important topic.
This novella is also for the visual learners.
Perfect. That's excellent. Thank you. So before we finish, I would like to ask our authors to tell us perhaps what they can, of course, about what they're working on next. So DJ, what is your current work in progress?
I have two. One is, they're both really still shaping themselves. And the first one, I'm trying to do a bit of a solar punk thing, but it gets a bit of dystopia as well. I don't know what the balance is going to be, but we'll see. And the other one is pure fantasy. It's about a city that has sprung up in like a huge dragon's paw print, like huge, like a whole city is there, and there's strange magic that filters through, and it stops technology, so it's a little bit what's the word I'm looking for, like you can't use computers, you can't use anything, so we go backwards in time with tech, but it's really strange tech. So that's pure fantasy and lots of fun. Yeah.
All right. And Nina, what about you? What are you working on at the moment?
I'm working on a novel at the moment. It's mainly a fantasy. It's maybe it's not quite as dark as some of my other work, but it's very much it's a kind of fantasy, really about alternate realities. Again, with a very strong climate change theme and about ecology. More going towards maybe political and dystopian. reality. So, but I'm almost there, so it's going good. So.
Excellent. And Tiffany, what about you?
I'm actually working on something totally different. I'm working on some picture books. I have 2 picture books that I'm trying to get these spreads out for. So, yeah.
Right. Are they for young adult? I imagine children, young adult. Is it?
Yeah, very young kids. Some hopefully will be good as a board book. Playing around with a few things. Yeah.
So you're writing the stories yourself, and you're working with an artist, or are you also doing the illustrations?
I'm also doing the illustrations, which that's what I'm my hang up is on. I'm practicing, yeah.
That's very good.
It's fun.
Right. Great, thank you. Steph, what is Russell Hemmell's next work of fiction?
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm working on 2 very different things. One is historical novel, but this one is pure history, and it is already with my agent. We are going through the last round to make it ready for submission to press. And the other is science fiction, pure science fiction, and is the young adult science fiction. So it's 2 very different things.
Well, good luck with the submission as well for the historical fiction. Okay, excellent. Or what are you writing on at the moment? Or what are you planning?
I'm actually also working on 2 things. One of them is speculative young adult, about a powerful young woman that lives in a dystopian future where words are linked to dreams. They're like prophecies for her dreams, and how she navigates in that world. And the second one is about crime-fighting witch that uses violence instead of words. And she meets a teacher that only uses her words to show her power. So both of them are about the power of words. I'm very into that right now.
Excellent. And are they both for young adult?
The first one, yes. The second one is more adult, I think.
Excellent, thank you. And Rhiannon, what about you? What are you working on at the moment?
Oh, I'm working on this delicious piece of darkness where a woman decides that she's sort of done with people, she's done with the city, and she spontaneously just goes and buys this rural property out in the sticks in the middle of nowhere to go and be alone. And when she arrives, she finds it's a semi-detached. So it starts as a bit of a joke, and it started as a bit of a joke, but the more I've written about it, it's sort of getting into this oxymoronic sort of state of isolation but claustrophobia at the same time, that sort of loneliness in a crowd, and it's just twisting and getting darker and darker the more I write it.
Very good. Excellent. Well, obviously the gentleman behind you, was that a gentleman? Do we know?
Yes, this is Bob.
Excellent. Oh, it was nice to have Bob tonight with us, actually. So there you go. Hi, Bob. Well, I would like to thank our Luna Novella authors for the year 2021 with release in 2022. I am excited to be working with existing Luna authors, but also to have met 4 amazing new authors to join our family as well. And the novellas are going to be released on the 8th of February. And at the time you're viewing this, the pre-order is already open. So you know what to do. So I would like once again to thank you all for being with us tonight, for learning more about our authors and the stories they've wrote. But of course, I would like to say good night and a huge thank you to DJ Daniels, to Russell Hemmell, Steph Bianchini, Tiffany Jimenez, Rhiannon Grist, Nina Oram, and Luca. Thank you all so much for being with us, and thank you all so much for staying with us tonight to meet our authors. So we wish you an amazing good night, and we'll see you again soon. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.